All right, first we're going to be looking at the addie or ADDIE model. And this is one of the more popular models in the education world today. And once we go through it, you will understand why. Let's see here. The first letter, A, stands for analyze. And during this period, we're going to analyze the instructional goals first. Exactly what we want to come out of the instruction, what we want the students to learn, and kind of what we're starting with. And so we want to take a look at where we're starting and where we want to end. And part of that is taking a look at your target audience and understanding what existing knowledge they have, what level of knowledge they have, the sort of language skills they have, whether you're going to be using professional language if we're dealing with older students, if we're going to have to tailor the instruction to younger students, that sort of thing. So we're learning about their language skills, etc. So basically, we've got to establish this before we can go any further. And once we've established that, actually, that kind of goes into what choices for technology we're going to use. And so once you understand if you're using older students, you can use a little more professional technology. Once you're using younger students, then you're going to have to understand where they're at, what sort of technology they can use, what technology they can't use, and what sort of technology is going to be a hindrance to learning, and they're focused on learning the technology, not learning the instruction. And so right here is one of the major points when you have to establish what technology can you use for this target audience and actually what you're teaching. So once you learn what you're teaching, you know what you're teaching, then you can kind of decide what kind of technology tools you want to use. You want to make sure that they line up with the audience and that they line up with what you're teaching, because you don't want to use technology that's not really lined up with what you're teaching about, and you don't really want to use technology that's not going to help you teach. And so this phase also, we're going to, once we figured out what we want to learn, we're going to figure out what required resources we need. So exactly what content that we need to get to the instructional goal. And once we figured that out, then we can figure out how we're going to facilitate that with the technology and what sort of technology is going to help facilitate this content the best way. And once you go through this, you'll be worried about your delivery and your instruction methods. And this is the point where your target audience comes into play and exactly what your instructional goals are with what you're going to use for your content, the technology, and all of that goes together. And this is what we use first to establish what exactly we're going to teach. The design phase, and during this design phase, we're going to be looking at the learning objectives, and we're going to have defined very specific measurable actions that will enable learning. And so we're going to figure out exactly what we need to do to fulfill the instructional goals. And with that, we're going to look at our instructional strategies, and we're going to need to establish clear links between the course content and the learning objections. And then we're going to need to make sure we're introducing the correct content to reach the learning goals. And so we're going to have to make sure everything is in a logical sequence and everything goes together. And we're going to need to make sure that the technology that we use is going to complement the actions and the content that we have decided for. So during this design phase, that's when we're kind of thinking about how we're going to present the course, what we're going to use to present the course, what technology we're going to use to present the course, and this is when we actually start doing the designing. So putting the course together, putting the content together, making sure that the course is in a proper sequence where the students are building upon their knowledge, one set to another set, and we're going to make sure that we do a little bit of testing and make sure that the strategies work out and have someone, an outside party, look at it and make sure that they go through the course and you yourself go through the course and make sure that it looks logical. Then we move on to the development phase, the second D. And during this, we are putting together, like we started in the design phase, the learning resources. So we're gonna put together the actual media. We're gonna, once we've already chosen what we're gonna use, we're gonna enter all the information. We're gonna make sure that we have everything correct, that there's no clerical errors, there's no spelling errors, things like that. And during this, we're gonna review everything, and then we're gonna revise everything until we believe that we've got the desired results. And so once we've reviewed everything and revised everything, we call that validation. We're gonna do what we call a pilot test. And once we have a pilot test, we're gonna listen to the information that whoever runs through it provides and see if we can make the course a little bit better. And so that's why you do the pilot tests. And so during this phase, this is the final phase of kind of putting the course together, making sure everything is set. Once we have everything set, then we are done here with the development phase. Move on here to the I, which is the implement phase. And during this phase, we're gonna be setting up the instruction. We're gonna be notifying the students that are involved in the class, making sure that everyone that's on the list is enrolled, and making sure that everybody has access to everything. And then we're gonna have our pre-course communications. We're gonna make sure that we talk to every student, have some minor communications with everybody. Probably if we're doing an online class, we wanna have some sort of video that shows yourself, talks about yourself. And so we want to make sure that we ourselves know if we're using Blackboard, D2L, something like that, that we know how the course runs, make sure that we know everything and that we have everything developed. And so this is when you start to put in how you're going to guide the course when we get into this phase. And so we're going to start to learn how our technology is going to guide the course, make sure everything is in a logical step 1, 2, 3 type deal, and make sure, like we did in the last step, everything is set up correctly on the website that you're using to teach the course. And so we want to make sure that everything's scheduled, everything's there, and that everyone's ready at the beginning of the course so we can just start day one. And so that comes with, sometimes if you have your roles, as soon as you get your roles, you can set that up, as soon as kids are out, they can take a look at the class and get ready. If they have any questions, they can contact you even before school starts and get some of their work done early. And so during this implement phase is when we start to engage the students. And you really want to have a choice of how you're going to engage them, whether it's going to be through email, whether you're going to use some sort of text messaging service, or if the school or the website you're using has something like that. You really want to establish that, and that will kind of guide how you're going to communicate whatever technology you choose. And you want to make sure that students can communicate with you and you can communicate with the students easily. And so that's this implement phase where you want to get that started. And once you've gone through the implement phase and started the course, gone through the course, you want to go through the evaluation phase. And this is the phase where you evaluate what happened. And so the first step, we'll do a formative evaluation, and that's before, where you kind of get an idea of what the students know, what they expect, what you expect. Make sure you know what they know, and you kind of know where you want them to get. And so you make that clear to them here. And then this is that formative evaluation. Maybe give them a pre-quiz, or have a conversation with them and talk about what they know and just kind of gain that. And after, you're going to have a summative evaluation, and this is where you're really going to take a look at how the students did in the course, how they did with the technology, and you can kind of take a look at how you taught the class, and how you can make it better. And so the first one is you're going to measure the perception, and that measures the degree of how the students felt about the course, how they did in the course, what they thought about the technology, what you could improve, what they thought they might be able to improve, and the things they liked, things they didn't like, that sort of stuff. And so you can give them a survey. Usually at the end of the year, you take a survey, or you can just kind of ask them personally in a chat room setting, how did you feel about the course, that sort of thing. And then you're going to measure their learning. And this is usually done by a quiz or something of that nature, where you want to learn or go back to what your instructional goals were and see if each student met those goals. So you want to know if the students met those goals and if they learned the knowledge. And so through this, you have your test, you have a paper. If they're putting together some sort of presentation or a project, this is the point where you're going to learn if the students actually learned what you were supposed to teach them. And so that kind of comes with a performance phase, where we're going to see if what we've taught can transfer into some sort of, say, real life situation or common task situation, where they're taking the knowledge that we taught them and putting it into a real world task. So once we've taught them how to do something very specific, then we're going to test them on that. And so again, that comes with a test. Usually you're going to have some sort of presentation. They're going to have to basically show you that they know what they're doing without you, helping them along. And so during this evaluation phase is really when you learn if they learned the knowledge that you were supposed to teach them, and if they have a good enough grasp of it to present it and perform it. And so this is the ADDIE model, or addie model. And each phase you want to take a look at the technology, what you're using. It usually, in the analyze phase, you want to make sure that the technology that you choose is going to meet your target audience. You want to make sure that in the design phase that you've used your technology well. And once you've designed it, it's easy to read, easy to go through, and that your students can go through your class in a sequence. And so during this design, develop, and analyze phase is really when you're going to focus on the technology that you're using and how it's going to guide your course. And so once you've done all of that, you want to evaluate how well everything went. And once you've done that, then you take a look and you start over again. And so next year, once you teach the course again, you take your evaluation and you move forward, put the steps in that you think will make it better, work on some more design, develop some more, and try a different way of implementing, and then evaluate it again. So it's kind of a loop. And so that's why this model is used quite a bit in education today, because it really forces you to take a look at what you're doing as a teacher, what the students are doing, the technology you're using, and if it's actually working. All right, the SAMR model here, or the substitution, augmentation, modification, or redefinition model, is defined by each one of those. So we'll take a look at each one and how it affects how we teach and choose our technology. And so the substitution phase is basically just when computer technology is used to perform the same task as was done before in the classroom. So we're literally just doing the same thing. Instead of having students take their test with a handwritten test, you print out a test, or they print out a test, and they write the answers down and hand it in. So it's really the exact same thing. Instead of them writing it down, they type it up and print it out. And so sometimes this was about when I was in high school, in the early 2000s, where it wasn't quite, we're doing our stuff online yet, where you type paper out, print it out, and hand it in to the teacher. Teacher grades the paper, hands it back to you. And so that feedback loop, as we'll talk about in the next part, is kind of slow. And so this is one of those things where you take a look at, is it necessary? Is it worth it? And is it going to be a waste of your time? So, say in the older days, it might have been a little bit more prevalent, but now the substitution isn't as prevalent. And once we get to the augmentation phase, that's when the computer technology offers an effective tool to perform the common tasks that you were doing before. So let's say this is in a class where we're going to take an online test, where the student takes their test online and you set up the parameters through whatever technology you're using, and they can get a pretty much instant grade. And so once they've got that grade, you have access to their grades, and you can provide them basically once they've taken the test feedback, not instantly, but usually you'd say in and out a day or so if you're telling people that you're grading their papers. And so during this phase, the feedback loop is a little bit quicker, and it's a little bit easier for both sides, the teacher and the learner, to communicate. And so during this phase, technology is not really taking over the classroom, but it's just helping you augment the class quicker and using it for feedback and communication. Once you get into the modification stage, this is the point where the classroom is starting to transform, where technology is starting to be necessary to complete tasks, but using this technology, we're using it to add to the creative process. And this is when learning starts to get learner-centric, where all the students have the same basic knowledge, but now we're kind of releasing them and saying, okay, use the technology, let's be creative, and let's see what you come up with. And so this is when you give students a task and you say, we're going to complete this project and we're going to use this technology, and each one of you go. And we're going to have a presentation about it. So like this, some people could create a video, some people can do audio, some people can do, both together. And, and that's when we start to redefine what's going on in the classroom, but we're still using the same classroom setting and still some of the same tasks, but we're using the technology to kind of move forward, getting closer to that professional outside of the learning room setting. And at this phase is when it really is important what kind of technology that you choose, and you make sure that you've gone through the addie model and you know who you're teaching to and what you're teaching them and what sort of technology is going to help that situation. And you want to make sure, like we talked about earlier, that it's not a hindrance, it's a help, and that you're focused on learning and using the technology to enhance the learning. We're not just learning about new technology to learn about new technology. And so once we've moved beyond that, that's when we start getting into the higher levels of education, and that's the redefinition phase. And that's when we start to redefine education. And this is when the computer technology allows for new tasks that, we weren't doing before we had these sorts of technology. And so this is at a high level, and this is when we're getting into real world things, and this is when we're moving into college level, graduate level, doctorate level type stuff. And this is when basically you look at some of the computer models that we have developed at the higher levels and are able to use in the teaching and learning. And I'll talk about this later also, but there's a program called the Junior Achievement Academy in Georgia. It's also in some other places, but they basically have a business town school where they teach students about entrepreneurship, building businesses, and these are kids in lower income areas, and they use the technology to simulate running a business, things that can happen in a business. If you do this, that will happen. If A happens, B will happen, and they use that to teach them how to run a business, and they learn, some other businesses. They learn about businesses, and then once they've learned in the classroom and they've used that technology, they take that and they send them out to real businesses. And so the things that they learn about in the class, they go out and do. And so with this sort of technology, they're learning things that they really wouldn't have been able to learn and then going out and implementing them. And so that's an example of how you would use the redefinition of the classroom, where you're using computer simulations and putting yourself in real world settings where you're not having to use real money. And, it was harder to do this sort of stuff without a computer to simulate what could happen in random simulations that nobody really knows about, so and can plan for. And so these type of programs help people that are going out into the business world. They help people in the science world where they can run simulations in space and things that they couldn't do before. And so this is really when learning is all computer based, all technology based, depending on what you're teaching. But basically, this is when it's necessary to have technology in the classroom. And so the SAMR model kind of helps you go through what your instructional goals are and what your target audience is, and exactly how you want to use your technology to teach them. And so it depends on how in depth you want to get. If you want to just go into the augmentation phase, where you're teaching a lot of information, but you're using the technology to have a quicker feedback loop, or if you were in the modification, where you're really using the technology to change the course of the classroom, where you're having students use technology to use their presentations or technology to communicate with each other outside the classroom. That's kind of the modern day classroom. And then once you get into the redefinition phase, that's when you really want to understand who you're dealing with and what your goal is in the end and how you want to tailor that technology to it. And so today we have a lot of technology, and that's good. And that's when we're really starting to redefine the classroom and how we teach. And so that's the SAMR model. All right, and so next up we have task-centered learning. And so task-centered learning is basically what it sounds like. There's a lot of different ways to define it, but basically task-centered learning is learning that revolves around students completing tasks that build upon each other. And so basically we're teaching students information and then we're having them put it to use. And so the studies have shown that students do better with information and remembering information and storing information with once they've learned information, putting it to use. And so whatever we're teaching the students, we'll talk about a little bit later, whatever we're teaching the students, after we're done teaching them, we're going to go and, like the other models talk about, put it into some sort of real world use. And that's sort of when the technology comes into play. A lot of times we can't go out into the real world and do exactly what we just learned. So that's why a lot of the simulations and a lot of the software that I'll talk about later, you can use to facilitate task-centered learning. And so it has a few steps here that I'll talk about and that are key. And one of them, the first one, is learning is promoted when learners learn through real world problems. So learners learn information better when they learn it in a way that it's gonna teach them or talk to them about the real world, the things that are going on that they're going to use this information with. So if we're talking about a business class, we're not just given numbers, we're talking about actual businesses, looking at businesses' books, looking at what they've done good, what they've done bad, and running the business simulation software, that sort of stuff. So we're not just learning information. Once we've learned that information, we're putting it in a real world setting with real world numbers and real world situations. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we bring all of this together later. But next up, we have that the new knowledge builds upon the old knowledge. And so this is when we look at the target audience in our instructional goal phase, looking at the target audience, the things that they know, and the things that we want them to learn. And so once we put those together, we look at how we can take what they know and build upon that knowledge. And so this is one of the most important parts of task-centered learning, because you're going to be using the tasks to kind of build on what they know. And sometimes you want to use an initial task to understand what they know. And so this might be at the beginning of a course, you have, have them do a task or a simple simulation about what the course is about, and, figure out what they know and where you need to get them. And so you want to make sure that the old knowledge, you're building on that old knowledge with the new knowledge, and you want to make sure you know exactly what that, old knowledge is. And once we've established that, it's been shown that students learn better when the new knowledge is demonstrated to them by the teacher. And so we want to, in this phase, we want to demonstrate to the students exactly what we mean. So we've taught them what we want to know, and now we're going to do a demonstration ourselves. So this could be you going through a simulation or a demonstration yourself, you yourself giving a presentation about it, you yourself showing a real world, you yourself telling a real world story. But they want to see that you, the teacher, know exactly what you're doing, and they want to see that, it's like a shop teacher showing the shop students, how to put together a wood frame. The shop teacher shows them where to screw the screws in first and hammer everything in. I know that's not the correct technology or the correct usage, but you get what I'm saying. The students watch the teacher do it, and then they go it and do it themselves. And so that's the next phase. The new knowledge is applied by the learner. So in that example, it's rudimentary, but the teacher shows you exactly what to do. Now you go do it. And so this phase, the new knowledge is applied by the learner, and like we talked about in the addie model and the smar model, that once you're building on the old knowledge, and this is how you really implement the new knowledge, you have the students go out and do it. And so when they go out and do it, they can make the mistakes, and once they've made the mistakes, you as the teacher can correct them, evaluate them, and start over. And this is where the task-centered learning, really is put on the students. And so they're learning by, doing tasks. And you want to help them in the start, but you want to get them to a point where they can do it themselves. And that's when you move into the next phase, is once you feel the students have a good grasp of the knowledge and they can do it themselves, you want to integrate whatever they've learned into the common task or the real world situation. And so whatever we're learning, we want to be able to now put that into kind of a real world situation. And so this is another simulation that, like we talked about earlier, the Junior Achievement in Atlanta and other places do, where the students are learning about a business and then they're simulating their business themselves. And so they have learned about how a business runs, what they need to run a business, all of that stuff. And then the teacher goes out and shows them, certain businesses. And then actually they have business leaders come in from different businesses and talk to them about how they started their business, how they run their business, some of the issues that they had with their businesses. And they go through with them that and some of the technology that they use for their businesses, because this is a technology course too. And so once they've gone through all of those sort of things, the students should have a good grasp of how they're going to do it themselves. And that's when they are tasked with doing their own business simulation. So they have to create a business in this computer real world setting, and they have a certain amount of money, and they're in a certain place with a certain demographic. And it's basically like, if you've ever heard of the game Sims, where you're competing against other towns. So basically you're kind of competing against other businesses in a simulated world. And so this is a task-centered learning phase where we've taken what we've learned and we're going to put it into good use. And so this is when you really focus on what sort of technology is going to help you and how that technology is going to guide you. And so that's a good example here of how the technology guides the course and how it helps you use task-centered learning. And so once we've figured out the tasks we want to learn and all that sort of stuff, sometimes we've got to think about how we want to learn to complete the task. And there's 4 levels that you have to think about when we want to get into task-centered learning. And you want to understand first what the problem is, exactly what we're trying to solve, where we're starting at, how we're going to get there. And so once we've established what the problem is, then we're going to look at the tasks required to solve that problem. So step 1, we know the problem. Now we're going to look at how are we going to solve that problem. What do we need to do to get to an end? And so this is where you start to take a choice here at how you're going to get to the ends of this problem. And then the next step is the operations that comprise the task. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are we going to do? Step this, step 2, step here, and what technology we're going to use, how we're going to implement it, and how that's going to help us. And then we get to the last step, and that's how the actions that compromise the task are put together. And so we've thought about the problem, we thought about what we're going to do to get to the ends of the problem, we've thought about what tasks we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and then the action phase is basically when we put all of those steps together. So we put our plan together, and then this 4th action step is when we're going to move forward and put our action together. And so once we've done that, it's kind of a loop. If we do first 1, 2, 3, step 4 in the action phase, we've completed our task, then that's good. If not, we're going to have to go back to step 2, step 3, maybe step 1, have a better understanding of what our problem is. And so this is, like we talked about with this junior achievement, their problem is they're going to start a business. They have a certain amount of money, and that's their problem. What are they going to do now? So the task required, they're going to take a look at how are they going to start the business, where they're going to put it, what they need to do all that sort of stuff, and they're going to get kind of a rough plan together. Once that, they're going to have the 3rd, kind of the operation phase, where they're going to start 1, 2, 3, how exactly am I going to do this? How are we going to get to the end here and sequence everything out, get your plan together. And then number 4 is this action phase where we're going to actually put it together in the simulation and try and get to an end point. And so it seems rudimentary, but you've got to think about that with every task that you present to the students, that they make sure they know what the problem is, make sure they know exactly what they need to do to get to an end point, have a set plan in this operation phase, and then run it out and see what they need to go back to evaluate, anything like that. And so the task-centered learning is really where students learn by doing, and this is what has been proven in education to show that is the best way for students to gain knowledge.